Welcome to the 5th plenary session, which is the V.V. Giri Memorial Lecture. The lecture is being delivered by Professor Martha Chen. She's lecturer, urban planning and design, Harvard Graduate School of Design, co-founder, international coordinator, emeritus and board member, WIEGO Network and chairperson of UNU-WIDER, Helsinki, Finland. I request you, ma'am, to please grace the dais. Professor Martha Chen is a lecturer in urban planning and design in the Harvard Graduate School of Design and co-founder, as I said, of the international coordinator, emeritus and board member of the Global Network, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, WIEGO, an experienced development practitioner and scholar. Her areas of specialization are employment, gender and poverty, with a focus on the working poor in the informal economy. Before joining Harvard in 1987, she had 2 decades of resident development experience working in Bangladesh with NGO BRAC and in India as field representative of Oxfam America. Dr. Chen co-founded and for 20 years led the WIEGO network, which is well known worldwide for its work to improve the status of the working poor in the informal economy through stronger organizations, improved statistics and research, and a more favorable policy environment. Dr. Chen received a PhD in South Asian Regional Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. She was awarded a High Civilian Award, the Padma Shri, by the Government of India in April 2011, and a Friends of Bangladesh Liberation War Award by the Government of Bangladesh in December 2012. Currently, she's chair of the boards of BRAC, Global, and the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research, UNU-WIDER. The lecture is being chaired by Professor Deepak Nayyar. He's Professor Emeritus, Jawaharlal Nehru University, former Vice-Chancellor, University of Delhi, and President of the Indian Society of Labour Economics. I request Professor Nayyar to please grace the dais. The traditional Apatani priest shawl, the traditional khada, and the memento with the weaves of Arunachal Pradesh, tribal weaves of Arunachal Pradesh. I request Professor Vandana Upadhyay now to present the shawl, the khada, to Professor Deepak Nayyar. And I request Professor Deepak Nayyar to please conduct the lecture.
I'd like to welcome everyone to this V.V. Giri Memorial Lecture. As you all know, I mentioned that yesterday in the inaugural session. V.V. Giri was among the founders of the Indian Society of Labour Economics, and he was president of the society from 1958 until 1978, when he passed away. V.V. Giri was born in Behrampur, Orissa. He studied at the University of Dublin. He was a member of the Central Legislative Assembly 1927 to 30. He was president of the All India Trade Union Congress, and trade unions were his first love, from 1926 and then again in 1942. He was Minister of Labour in what was then the government of Madras, the erstwhile Madras Presidency. He was Minister for Labour in the Union Cabinet, 1952 to 54, Governor of Uttar Pradesh, and that was his connect with V.P. Singh, 1957-8, Vice President of India, 67-69, and ultimately President of India for 5 years. He wrote 2 books, many articles, and was awarded the Bharat Ratna in 1975. It is a special privilege that we have Martha Chen deliver the V.V. Giri lecture, which has always been a high point in every annual conference of ours. Martha and I go back a long time together. We just worked out that we first met each other in 1983. That was exactly 40 years ago. We have much in common, although her research interests and her passions are very similar to those of my wife Rohini's, in exactly the same domain. They've spent a lot of their professional life. But we do have in common that she is chairman of the board of UNU-WIDER at present, and I was chair of the board several years ago. So, Martha, may I say welcome on behalf of the ISLE. May I also say that I don't think of Martha as an international guest. She is as Indian as we are.
There, we'll start again. Good afternoon and namaste. It's really such a pleasure to be here. I've wanted to come to an ISLE annual conference for many years. I've been invited several times, but this is the first time because of when it is. It's not the week before Christmas, which is always hard for some of us. And it's such an honor to give this particular memorial lecture, and I just learned that V.V. Giri and I share an interest in Uttar Pradesh and in trade unions. I knew about other aspects of his illustrious career. And I want to thank the ISLE, particularly Deepak, and also Jimol, and of course Alak, for inviting me to speak, and I want to thank all of you for being here. So what I'm going to try to do is look at the dominant theories and policy responses to the informal economy through the lens of some reality checks, some evidence. And this evidence includes statistics from the ILO and statistics from your own NSSO. It will include research and experience of the WIEGO network over the last 25 years. And I think the one other observer that I quote quite often is Ravi Kanbur. So my remarks will be in 4 parts. I'll start with the theory about structural adjustment or transformation, rather, and theory on what drives informality. I will intersperse the evidence throughout, but I'll begin by sharing the size and composition of the informal economy and the links with poverty and inequality. In terms of the dominant policy responses, I'll look at 2 categories. Formalization, it's what do you do about the informal economy? You formalize. And what does that mean? It has many different meanings, but I'll look at the conventional meanings. And urban policies, because we're living in an urbanizing world, and if you're an urban self-employed, what really impinges on your work are actually the rules of the game in the city, the urban policies. And then I'll share some alternative, more enabling policy responses, some recent global norms, but also the demands of organizations of informal workers. And I'll end by a call for rethinking the informal economy, the policy responses to it, but also rethinking, since I'm here with a number of labor economists, how we think about labor markets and labor regulations. But before I get into the heart of the lecture, I have to deal with 2 myths about the informal economy. The first is that there's no definition. We don't have a definition. There are actually 2 official international statistical definitions. The second myth is that we don't have any data, or it's hard to measure, and it's not adequate. But we now have global estimates, the first ever global estimates, which I will share. So the International Conference of Labor Statisticians, I assume you all know about it, is convened every 5 years by the ILO, and its mandate is to establish international standards on labor statistics. In 1993, and I should note this is 20 years after the informal economy was sort of discovered, if you will, in Africa by Keith Hart and the ILO Employment Mission, the ICLS came up with an enterprise-based definition, which is the informal sector, which refers to all production and employment in informal enterprises. And those, in turn, are defined as enterprises which are not legally incorporated and are also not registered with a national authority. But 10 years later, there was a broader definition that was employment-based that was adopted. And this is the definition of informal employment, which is employment without social protection or paid annual and sick leave through work. And this can be in informal enterprises, it can be in formal firms, and for households. And then the informal economy is all the units, all the activities, all the workers so defined, and the output from them. We have, thankfully, the first ever global estimates of informal employment published by the ILO in 2018, based on data from over 100 countries that were measuring informal employment as defined by the ICLS. And what we now know is that 61% of all workers globally are informally employed. That's 2 billion workers. If you look at geographic regions, South Asia has the highest rate at 78%, followed by sub-Saharan Africa, excluding, it should be Southern Africa, not just South Africa, at 76%, Southeast Asia and Latin America at about half. If you look at the percent of informal employment by country income groups, and here these are the World Bank country income groupings, in developing countries, 90% of all workers are informal, 67% in the emerging middle income countries, and it's really only in developed countries where it's a low rate at 18%. And I ask you to think, where does India fall? India's rate is about 90%, so it's higher than the average for South Asia, and it's about the average for developing countries, although India is now an emerging economy. The first ever global estimates also included an estimate of informal enterprises. And you may ask, how do you get a measurement of an enterprise from a labor force survey? And the ILO used the definition of enterprises equals the sum of employers and own account workers. And I've just summarized here what percent of total employment informal enterprises are and what percent of all enterprises. And so globally, they represent 52% of total employment. And if you recall, I said informal employment is 61%. The other 9% is 7% of all informal workers are in formal firms, and 2% are in households. And you can see the figures for the other country income groups. The first ever global estimates also looked into the relationship between informal employment and poverty, and they found that in all country income groups, a higher percentage of informal workers than of formal workers are from poor households. And considered another way, a higher percentage of workers from poor households than from non-poor households are informally employed. But it's also important to remember that informal earnings help reduce poverty by helping many near-poor households from becoming poor, many poor households from becoming poorer, and some poor households from being able to work their way out of poverty. And a WIEGO colleague did some analysis of South Africa data that proves these points. It's also important to think about the relationship between informality and inequality. And we know, as I said, that informal workers are more likely than formal workers to be from poor households, but we also know that their earnings are lower on average than the earnings of formal workers. And in 2002, the ILO had a report published for a discussion on decent work and informal employment. And the case was made with evidence that informal workers face greater deficits than formal workers in the 4 pillars of the ILO decent work agenda: opportunities, economic opportunities, rights, social protection, and voice, the voice being in the social dialogue of the tripartite system. It's also important to realize there's inequality within the informal economy. By status and employment and sex is what is represented in this pyramid. And the WIEGO pyramid emerged from an analysis in 1998 of all the existing literature by S.V. Sethuraman, anyone remember him from the ILO, and of the available data by Jacques Charmes from France. And what they found, they were 2 dense reports, so I captured it in this pyramid. I had to summarize what they found. And so at the tip of the informal economy pyramid are the employers. And the employers are those who hire others, and they are the only group, wherever we've tested this data, that are non-poor on average. All of the other segments fall below a minimum wage or a poverty line. So informal wage workers who are sort of regular, they know where they're going to work in the morning. Own account operators, those who don't hire others. And then the casual informal wage workers. And a category that we tend to forget, the industrial outworkers and home workers. And then, of course, the contributing family workers at the base. And we know that men are concentrated in the top 2 segments, women in the bottom 2, and that the poverty risk of being from a poor household increases as you go down the pyramid. And a colleague, again, Michael Rogan in South Africa, tested this pyramid in 2015 and found very much this hierarchy, but the data there allowed for distinguishing between employees in formal firms from employees in informal firms, and also included domestic workers. And it found, of course, that men are more likely than women to be employers and own account workers and employees. And women are more likely than men to be contributing family workers and domestic workers. And that among the own account operators and the employees in the formal firms, men earn more and have lower poverty risk than women. So much so that women own account workers earn just over half what men own account workers earn, and less than both groups of male employees. WIEGO works very closely with G. Ravindran, who many of you know, who retired from the NSSO as, I think, Additional Secretary of Statistics. And he did an analysis of employment and inequality by caste in India. This table captures the percentage distribution of the total population in India by main source of household income and caste groups, with corresponding poverty headcount ratios. And I didn't include all the caste groups, but the scheduled castes, fully 46% of them are in casual work, and they have the highest poverty headcount ratio. Among the upper castes, only 11% in casual work, and the lowest poverty headcount ratio is for upper castes in regular wage employment. And of course, the OBCs fall somewhere in between, and the scheduled tribes actually have a higher poverty headcount ratio than the scheduled castes. So inequality needs to be looked through many dimensions. But of course, the greatest inequality is between the super rich and the working poor. And pre-COVID, we know from Piketty and others that there was this unprecedented concentration of wealth and returns to capital. And we know that technological progress has made it easier for the owners of capital to substitute capital for labor and to contract labor without contributing to worker benefits and protections. So think Uber drivers and industrial outworkers. And in part, this is because, and this is a point that I think we all need to recognize, is that informality at the tip of the economic pyramid with the wealthy individuals and corporations is overlooked and rewarded. Think Amazon not paying its taxes. While informality at the base of the economic pyramid, the working poor and the informal economy, is targeted and penalized. And the COVID-19 pandemic recession has only further compounded these trends. So the super rich got richer, they flew into space, they built mega yachts, and the working poor in the informal economy got poorer, they went further into debt and depleted their savings. And many new poor emerged. So let's turn to two sets of theories, one about structural transformation and the others about drivers of informality. As you all well know, in the mid-1950s, it was widely predicted that economic growth would lead to sectoral transformation. The economy would shift from agriculture to manufacturing and services, and labor markets would shift from traditional self-employment to modern wage employment. In due time, the Lewis turning point. However, economic growth and structural transformation defied these predictions, and different patterns emerged. Economic growth outpaced employment growth, and economic growth was not associated with widespread industrialization in many countries, and economic growth outpaced structural transformation. And I think we've seen all three patterns in India. So what does the structure of employment today look like? If you look at the percentage distribution of both total workers and informal workers, there has been a shift out of agriculture, but it's much more into services than into industry, which is manufacturing plus, as you know. And in terms of the shift from wage employment to, from self-employment to wage employment, it's happened, but only 56% of all workers in the world are wage employed. 44% of all workers in the world are self-employed. And of course, the transformation has been slower among informal workers. Now, I have two dense tables. I debated keeping them, but I did. In these, I've ranked the geographic regions by the rate of informality, so the highest rate at the top and below. In this data, the developed countries in those regions have been excluded. This was tabulations done by the ILO for us. And what you see is that the transformation from agriculture, out of agriculture, is much slower where you have higher rates of informal employment, and it begins to take off and move to services when you have the decreasing rates of informal employment, and the rates of the transition within countries or within regions is always slower for informal workers. And I've included the India percentages in green just to suggest where India comes out. And the second table does the same thing, but for status in employment. And you also see that self-employment, particularly own-account workers, is very high in the countries with a high percentage of informal employment, and then begins to shift over to wage employment. Another set of theories is about what drives or causes informality. And there are multiple theories on this. There are four dominant schools of thought. Historically, were initially the dualist, who argued there was an imbalance in the rate of population growth and employment growth, and a mismatch between people's skills and the structure of modern economic opportunities. The structuralists argued that was actually the nature of capitalism, of capitalist growth, that was driving informality in the interests of the corporations. The legalist, this is Hernando de Soto et al., said it's the hostile legal environment and cumbersome bureaucracy that makes it very hard for an informal operator to register her or his business. And then there's the voluntarist school that says really it's just a choice by the informal workers or operators. They weigh the cost benefits of being formal and informal and decide to be informal. The two dominant schools of thought today are that it's over-regulation. It's a regulatory burden on formal firms and workers. And another related one, that if you extend non-contributory social protection to informal workers, it creates an incentive for workers and firms to be informal. And of course, there are a lot of other causal theories and a different perspective on regulations, that actually we've been in an era of deregulating labor markets, and that's led to informalization. And there's others who understand that for some informal operators, there's no regulatory environment that allows them to be legal. They're outside the provisions of formal regulation. You know, permits are not extended, licenses to street vendors, for instance. Technology and trade, urbanization and migration, economic policies, economic downturns and crises, culture, tradition, social norms, think gender norms, and think inherited caste occupations. So there are multiple theories, and all of them actually are relevant for certain slices of the informal pie in certain contexts, because the informal economy is so heterogeneous. But I'd like to just examine the two dominant schools of thought on what drives informality. So for regulation and informality, I turn to Ravi Kanbur. And Ravi wrote in 2014 in a piece reflecting on informality, and what he said in conclusion was, to explain increases in informality, the regulatory burden would have had to have increased. But in the last 2 decades of liberalization, the regulatory burden has, if anything, decreased. So the regulation-based explanation of increasing informality is thus weak at best. Ravi also came up with an ABCD model, which I'm sure many of you know, about whether firms comply with regulations. And A is the firms that comply. B and C are those who evade or avoid the regulations. And the outsiders are those who don't fall in the ambit of the regulations. And he tested his model by looking at the non-compliance of firms with India's Factories Act of 2011, which requires, as you know, manufacturing firms of a certain size to register and comply with other regulations. And what he found, he and a student, I think it was, Chatterjee, they found that the formal firms, A, that comply represent only 1.1% of all firms and 25% of workers in manufacturing. The evaders and the avoiders combined represent 1.9% of firms and 11% of workers. And a full 97% of firms in manufacturing are outside the ambit of the regulation and represent 64% of workers. So his conclusion, which I urge you to consider, is that the policy focus on deregulation as a route to employment and productivity growth has to be balanced with a focus on improving the productivity of those workers that would not be affected greatly or at all by the legislation in question. Then there's this other dominant theory, which is that non-contributory social insurance and subsidized public services, particularly in health, create a perverse incentive for informality, that formal workers and firms will turn to informality, and they are non-productive, ergo a drag on the economy. And this dominant assumption was popularized by Santiago Levy in his book on the Seguro Popular insurance program in Mexico, which targeted informal workers. And his book, as you may well know, was Good Intentions, Bad Outcomes. Again, the WIEGO network has been involved in a project to challenge economic orthodoxy with sound evidence. And we commissioned a literature review and case studies of universal social protection schemes, which found a mixed impact on employment and found that informal workers receive fewer benefits than formal workers, even under what are called universal social protection schemes. We also commissioned an econometric analysis of labor force and administrative data by a pair of Mexican economists, and they found that the Seguro Popular program did not have the predicted impact. Specifically, there was no decrease in formal jobs, no switching from formal jobs to informal jobs, and no effect on the wages of formal workers. We've also worked with INEGI, the National Statistical Institute of Mexico, in particular with the statistician Rodrigo Negrete, and he's analyzed the national data during the Seguro Popular period from 2004 to 2019. And if anything, the share of informal employment in total employment decreased over that period. And the contribution of informal employment to GDP remained roughly the same at just under 25%. So, turning to dominant policy responses. Formalization, as I mentioned, is sort of, okay, let's formalize the informal economy, and you ask people what they mean. And there are two standard approaches. One is you create formal jobs and move them out of the informal work they do. And the second is you regulate and tax the informal enterprises. It's also important in an urbanized global world to look at urban policies, because for the self-employed, the policies of the city have dire consequences often. So, the conventional approach number one is create formal jobs. But not enough jobs are being created to absorb, and this is an ILO estimate, 470 million people are either unemployed or want employment but are not actively seeking work because they're discouraged in some way, which is much less than the 2 billion that are informally employed. So which of the problems are we going to solve, unemployment or informal employment? And employment growth rate is actually slowing globally. And many of the jobs that are being created are informal, and many once formal jobs are being informalized. So why just focus on creating jobs? Why not focus on supporting informal workers and their livelihoods? The conventional approach number two is regulate and tax informal enterprises. And here again, Ravi Kanbur with Michael Keane from the IMF did an analysis was published in 2014, and they found that many informal wage or subcontracted workers are not liable to pay payroll or corporate taxes and often earn too little to fall above the threshold for income tax, but that many of them pay taxes of various kinds, operating fees, license fees, market rents. As part of our economic orthodoxy project, the WIEGO network partnered with the International Center for Tax and Development at IDS Sussex and with the, I forget what ISER stands for, at the University of Ghana, and did a study of 2,700 informal self-employed in central Accra, Ghana, and found that 66% pay at least one tax or fee, and this is not including the indirect VAT tax on supplies, which many of them pay. And they found that the tax or fee burdens are highly regressive. The ratio of all taxes and fees to earnings was much higher for informal workers than for formal, and higher for the lowest quintile of informal workers, 9%, than for the highest quintile of informal workers at 2%. Turning to urban policies, what WIEGO knows from our work with the urban informal workforce is that the common approaches to street vendors who are emblematic of urban informal workers can be characterized as 3 R's. And this typology was developed by my colleague, Sally Rover. Repression, which is you outlaw street vending. Eviction and campaigns, eviction campaigns rather, or to recover public space, and the daily low-level forms of harassment, which is confiscation of goods, bribes, and other forms of harassment. And the relocation, you find there are 2 arguments for relocation. One is public space should be used as a vehicle for investment. And second, vendors should invest their own capital in private off-street vending sites. And then the 3rd R is regulation, over-regulation, if you will. Role of the state seen to be to control and govern access to public space and to restrict licenses in accordance with policy priorities. And again, the WIEGO network did a 10-city study on what is driving change or impact on informal workers. And city government policies and practices are the dark green, were the dominant for home-based workers and street vendors. Value chain dynamics were important for the waste pickers, and macroeconomic trends, inflation, and the high cost of inputs and decreased consumer demand were also important for all 3 groups. But there is the possibility of an alternative policy approach. And there's been movement towards that. And I just want to share very quickly what that might look like. And I'll begin with the SDGs. If you want to improve the productivity and the security of income of informal workers, there are several of the SDGs that are particularly critical. Number one would be SDG 8, which is economic growth as well as decent and productive work. But if you're an urban informal worker, the sustainable cities goal is also important. And SDG 16, if you're going to have strong institutions, they too need to be just and inclusive. And then if you have these intermediate goals, it will help reduce their poverty and their hunger and increase their well-being. I would also make the case that the global community is not going to be able to realize these SDGs so long as they stigmatize and penalize informal workers. Because supporting informal workers is a key pathway to each of these SDGs. Turning back to formalization, there is a new approach to formalization. The ILO had a 2-year standard-setting discussion at the International Labor Conference on Recommendation 204. And this is a recommendation on transitioning from the informal to the formal economy. And I've just summarized here some key provisions in that recommendation that delegations of informal workers fought fairly hard to secure. Most informal workers are from poor households trying to earn a living against great odds. Was very important because the beginning of the discussion was to see the informal workers as plucky entrepreneurs avoiding regulations. And that many of these informal units are actually single person or family operations. And very importantly, that the livelihood should not be destroyed in the process of formalization. And then the fact that regulated use of public space is important to urban livelihoods, and regulated access to natural resources is important for rural livelihoods. There have been some other global norms that point in the right direction. There have been 2 ILO conventions on informal workers, one on home workers, industrial outworkers, the other on domestic workers. And both of these mandate that labor rights and worker benefits should be extended to home workers and domestic workers, respectively. The new urban agenda of Habitat 3 had 2 articles on being more inclusive of the urban working poor, of their contributions. And then, of course, there's the movement towards universal social protection, and there's been renewed commitment given the devastating impact and inadequate relief during COVID-19. So what do the workers themselves want coming out of the COVID-19 crisis? And I've summarized here in a platform of demands from 11 cities where we did a study in 2020 and 2021 of the impact. And first, they need continuing relief. They need financial assistance to pay off debts and restore savings and assets. And they too want to be part of the recovery plans. Recovery cash grants, stimulus packages, including government procurement. And yet wherever we work, and we work in 90 countries around the world, informal workers have not been targeted in any recovery plan. There's some talk about support to MSMEs, but it always goes up towards the small and medium and not the micro. And they want broader reforms, an enabling policy and legal environment, universal social protection. I'll skip that slide, but I'll end with the call for rethinking. As you can tell, I feel we need to rethink the informal economy as the broad base of the economy and workforce. And we need to shift the policy responses from conventional formalization to this alternative, more enabling formalization, and punitive responses to responses which protect and promote. And a focus purely on labor regulation should shift to understanding that macro, micro, and sectoral economic policies impact the informal economy, particularly the self-employed. And we need to look at labor markets and regulations. So bear with me for a few more minutes on this rethinking. Should we think about the informal economy as a policy conundrum or a policy solution? They represent, after all, the majority of all workers, especially the working poor. They constitute the broad base of the economy. They provide essential goods and services, which we came to understand a bit more during the COVID crisis. Yet the dominant narratives stigmatize the informal economy as either a residual of the past that will disappear with economic growth, or a problem, a drag on the economy, rather than as part of the solution. Why don't we look at why they're not as productive as they might be, rather than just say they are non-productive? And the dominant policy responses impose costs and risks on the informal workers. But as I made the point before, if we support them and their livelihood activities, this could help us reduce poverty, promote economic growth, and achieve the SDGs. They are part of the solution to the development challenge. And this COVID-19 moment, and we're not through it yet, or at least the informal workers are not through it yet, is possibly an inflection moment. And I say this because for the very first time in a broad crisis, it was recognized that there was a disproportionate impact on informal workers. Think the global recession. What was the informal economy? It was a cushion for formal workers to fall back on. This is the first crisis where it's recognized that there was a disproportionate impact on informal workers. And it's shown a spotlight on the pre-existing disadvantages and injustices faced by informal workers. Getting health care, being vaccinated, getting to work. And it spotlighted the role of informal workers as essential frontline workers. Who else is producing, processing, selling, cooking, and delivering food? Who's providing health care, cleaning, childcare, transport, waste removal, other essential services? So where are we going to go post-COVID? Is it going to be the bad old deal? It could be a worse New Deal. We see evidence around the world of, in the name of public health or economic recovery, states, governments penalizing the informal economy. One branch of the World Bank had the audacity to say, tax the informal economy to fund recovery. They don't have, they're deeply in debt. They have no savings left. And their earnings have not recovered. And then finally, just because this is a room of labor economists, if you think about the structure of employment today with so much informal employment and so much self-employment, we need to think differently. We need to go beyond employment and unemployment to look at underemployment, the quality of employment. We have to think beyond wage employment to look at self-employment and contracted work. We need to go beyond the demand for labor. Think about the street vendor, the self-employed street vendor. It's really a demand for their goods and services that matter, and they're both supplying and demanding their own labor. And we need to move beyond supply and demand. The institutions' rules of the game are really what are impinging negatively on the informal workers. And we need to think beyond labor regulations. With the labor markets globally that are 44% self-employed and only 3% are people who hire others, labor regulations are not that relevant to them. It's the regulation of the relationships of production and distribution, and it's an enabling legal and policy environment. Thank you.
Martha, for what might be described as a tour de force, you have, in the space of 45 minutes, provided a international comparative perspective on the informal economy. In doing so, you have talked about both theory and policy, but juxtaposed it, interspersed it with reality. And that is very nicely done. I think we really do, what I really loved about the lecture was that you've sketched the big picture about the informal economy, not so much by joining the little dots, but by using bold strokes on a wide canvas. And that highlights both the problem and the possible solutions. There is only one thing that I would urge you to incorporate into it when you write, which is that there is a temporal dimension to the evolution of the informal economy, that it might have begun life in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the developing world, as an employer of the last resort, in a sense, a derivative of the Lewis model, where people could find employment only in the informal services sector. But subsequently, as you've shown, the motivation to circumvent existing regulations and the desire to save resources, scarce resources, on social protection has led to an extension of the informal economy very significantly in the developing world. But at the same time, the advent of markets and globalization has created an informal economy in industrialized countries, which really has happened because the nature of work has changed. Employment and jobs are no longer what they used to be in terms of permanence, social protection, healthcare, superannuation. Work has been casualized. The nature of work has changed. It's all there in your story, but the temporal dimension could be made more explicit, particularly in terms of the distinction between developing countries and industrialized countries, both of which now have this problem in common. Just said it would be very nice to highlight further the policy dilemmas that arise in different contexts, where some solutions could worsen the problem if attempting to formalize the informal economy is going to destroy livelihoods. Or if the introduction of regulations on, say, street vendors is going to destroy livelihoods. And there are trade-offs, and who are the decision makers. But may I say, very nice, stimulating lecture. We have time. You took less than 45 minutes. We have time for a few questions. Not an unlimited number, but a few. Padmini, yeah, and then you, sir, after that. Padmini.
Yeah. Thank you for a very neat presentation, and it was very lucid and very clear. The question that I have is, would it be possible for you to elaborate on how the developed countries benefit by informality in developing countries? Thank you.
So, just one moment. This gentleman first, and after that you.
Hi, I'm Anjur. Just wanted to ask that hierarchy, the triangle, inverted triangle that you showed of the different levels of informality, where would platform work fit within that framework?
I'm Suresh Agarwal. I think whatever I could understand is that the focus of the entire presentation has been mainly on the cities. So does it mean this problem is not relevant or less important for rural areas, especially in a country like India?
That person over there.
Hello,
the last question in
Madam
this round.
Shah. Myself, Bharat Shah. My question is, there is a lack of social security measures for informal workers. And nowadays, a current topic has established regarding gig workers and gig economy in underdeveloped countries. But we should concentrate more on social security measures, which is lacking.
Thank you. That's 5 questions, Martha. So the floor is yours. Sorry, can I get a mobile mic for? You could, if you prefer to stand, you could do it from here.
So I'll start with Padmini. I may forget all of, but yours was the relationship between developed countries and informality in developing countries. And the most clear example is the outsourcing of production and our global value chains, right? So you have the brand name firms marketing mainly in the global north, but increasingly in the global south. But the production is happening in the global south, and the distance between the brand firm and the people in that chain is, well, there can't be any greater distance in wealth and power than, let's say, the people who sew shoe uppers in Indonesia for Nike shoes that get marketed around the world. So that's one aspect of the structural relationships, is that outsourcing of production that we know so much about. But there would be, of course, other examples of how they source goods and how they distribute goods. The original bottom of the pyramid theory was seeing the working poor at the base as a market for goods as well. So there, we could tease out quite a few structural linkages. Where the platform workers fit in that segmented model would be conceptually with the industrial outworkers, because there's a new category, status and employment, that's being developed, which is dependent contractors. So the industrial outworkers and the platform workers would both be seen as dependent contractors who look self-employed, but they actually depend on a supply chain or they depend on a platform. Where we would come out once we test the model with data, I would imagine the platform earners, some of them, but we heard yesterday from GMOL that there is a range of platforms, but some of the platform earners will probably earn more than your average industrial outworker, I would guess. So we would have to test the empirics of the model in terms of the earning and poverty risk going forward. In the rural areas, some of our motivation to focus on the urban is that there was a whole movement of looking at livelihoods, which was focused on the rural. And I think there are analogs going both ways, but we thought it was important to have a livelihood focus in the urban areas given the urbanizing world. And also because you can find whole libraries of books on agricultural labor and smallhold farmers and land and all of those issues, but there was much less on the urban informal. But I think there's lots of scope to think through what are the dynamics of globalization as they're affecting the rural populations. And we've done some work on contract farmers and how they link into the global system. And the point about social protection, I'm not sure whether it was a comment or a question. Maybe you could ask me the question. Was there a question? It was a comment, right. So I think I would agree with your comment. Yeah? So, any others?
Let me just ask, are there any other questions? We are almost out of time, but if someone has irresistible temptation to ask Martha one more question, it's welcome.
But just to say, I think your point about the temporal dimension, and there's informality in all kinds of new guises, right?
Yes.
All kinds of new guises, and we do write about that and try, but we have decided, we've decided that we're going to explore how much to look at, let's say, platform workers, as opposed to the traditional categories that we look at, just because there's, we're a small team and small bandwidth. And it's a growing phenomenon, but not nearly as widespread as the other categories that we tend to work with. So thank you all very much.